Hello, and welcome to the module on public narrative. We're going to start by looking at the crisis of demotivation in companies and teams. We're going to look then at the history of stories and why our ancestors developed this very special social technology, why they needed it, and how it helped turn human societies into what we became. We're going to look then at how stories affect the brain, a little bit of neuroscience, and how we can use neuroscience to tell more powerful and inspiring stories. And then we're going to explore a technique of leadership called public narrative, which is a technique that has been used to create movements and campaigns, and also cohesion and purpose in teams. And we're going to talk a little bit about this method and how you can apply it. So why talk about stories in the School of Collective Intelligence? What does this have to do with groups and collaboration? Well, I'll ask you another question. Can we create collective intelligence if everyone's demotivated? In the most recent study of workplace engagement by Gallup, which is a major survey company in America, they asked a series of questions. In the US, to 13,000 employees in different sectors. In Morocco, around 800. In France, around 1,300. And based on the answers to these questions, they put workers into three categories. Categories of engagement, people who were very excited, enthusiastic about their jobs. People who were not engaged, they were passive, essentially, and just doing the minimum to get by. And then a third category of people who were actively disengaged, who were sabotaging, either consciously or unconsciously, the company and the teams they were a part of. And in the United States, in the survey in 2023, about a third were engaged. About half were not engaged. And about 1 in 6 were actively disengaged. And do you think it would be more or less in Morocco or France? Well, the number in Morocco was fewer employees engaged, around the same amount not engaged, but about twice as many actively disengaged. And in France, even less engaged, about 3 in 4 not engaged, and again around 1 in 6, 1 in 5 actively disengaged. So in both of these countries, a majority were not engaged, and a large majority were either not engaged or actively disengaged. So this shows that in general, motivation is a crisis across different countries, across different sectors. We can see that, judging by the figures of this State of the Global Workplace report, that the countries with the most engaged employees are in South Asia. The countries with the least engaged employees are in Europe. And every other region of the world is somewhere in between, with North Africa being low on engagement, but not as low as Europe. And this disengagement has real costs for business. The same study showed that disengaged employees have 37% higher absenteeism and 18% lower productivity than their colleagues who are engaged. And that means that every disengaged employee at a company is given essentially a 3,400 euro bonus for being disengaged. They are costing the company another third more than they, for every 10,000 euros they make, they have a third more cost to the company. So this problem of disengagement has real impact on the business. And what I want to argue is that this crisis of motivation has something to do with how we communicate to each other. As part of this new initiative, our team offers employees and their managers a new cross-functional project management platform. Its features will increase visibility on the status and performance of projects and strengthen synergies between our different teams. Does this sound familiar? Yes, because this is very often how we communicate in professional settings. We know how to inform, we're trained how to inform, but not how to inspire. And Marshall Ganz, a hero and mentor of mine, a professor at Harvard Kennedy School and one of the architects of the grassroots strategy of Barack Obama's presidential campaign in 2008, he likes to say that if you want to inform someone, you need good facts. If you want to change how someone thinks, though, you need an inspiring story. And to mobilize that person, your story needs to become their story. So public narrative is a leadership method that harnesses the power of stories to create motivation and alignment in teams and communities. Why stories? Because this is the most natural way for us to communicate what we value, what gives meaning and purpose to our work. And if we don't have meaning and purpose in our work, we cannot be motivated and engaged. As Marshall puts it, knowledge and data can influence belief, but only emotions and values create the motivation to act. So let's look a little bit about why we tell stories at all. Well, for 95% of the history of our species, our ancestors lived in pretty small groups of 150 people or less, people who they all knew personally. They knew their names. They lived alongside each other, lived in and died with this same small group of people. And our language evolved to enable collaboration. To be able to talk about what happened yesterday to us in order to make a plan to do something tomorrow. This is something that human beings are uniquely able to do, is to use language to share our experiences, to make plans, to make arguments, to teach lessons. And all of these uses of language helped us adapt to a fast-moving and often very competitive environment. We were not the biggest species. We were not the strongest species. We were not the fastest species. We were the most collaborative, or capable of the most complex collaborations. But in times of famine or drought or climate change, resources could become scarce. And in those times of crisis, the groups that could collaborate and stay together and be cohesive became the most successful. And therefore, those groups are the ones that transmitted their practices, their cultures, down to their children and ultimately to us. And these were high-stakes situations where if only one person was selfish or violent or abusive, they could threaten the survival of the whole group. So this issue of cohesion, of motivation to act together and to protect each other was a life or death issue. And so the evidence begins of storytelling begins around 100,000 to 200,000 years ago, where we think that language had developed to the ability to create stories that were passed on from one generation to another. And what Christopher Boehm, anthropologist Christopher Boehm, in his book Hierarchy in the Forest argues, is that stories created moral communities. What's a moral community? Well, community is a group of people, but not just any group of people that have a common identity, that shares something in common that makes them different than other groups. And a moral community has an additional element, which is not only we have something in common, like a common ancestor or a common facial features or jewelry, but we have a common code of how we do things. We have a common sense of what is right and wrong. We have a common sense of what is important and worth sacrificing for. We have a common sense of how we punish people who break the rules. And interestingly, Boehm proposes that in these early human societies, that it was likely that women played the leading role in spreading this social information because it was critical to know who was respecting the rules and who was breaking the rules. And they often used nonviolent shaming or persuasion because women tended to be less tall, less physically strong than men, but more influential on the kinds of nonviolent pressure that kept people respecting the rules. And of course, women played always the predominant role in transmitting values to children. And so that women may have been the first master storytellers, not just stories about who was breaking the rules, but how we know what the rules are. And that we learned these values from the stories that our mothers and grandmothers told us. So let's give an example of a story that has been passed down from one generation to another now for around 29 centuries. For 40 days, the giant had roared his challenge to the king's army. "Send me your best warrior. If I win, your people will become our slaves. If he wins, we will be yours." The king's soldiers were too afraid to fight. A young shepherd was sent from the countryside with food for his brothers, soldiers in the king's army. When he heard the giant's challenge and saw that no one was answering it, he went right to the king himself. "Your Majesty," said the shepherd, "no one should be afraid of this giant. I will go and fight him." "No," answered the king. "How could you fight him? You're just a boy, and he has been a soldier all his life." "I have killed lions and bears who have attacked my father's sheep," replied the shepherd, "and I will do the same to this giant. The Lord will save me from him." The king reluctantly agreed, but insisted that the shepherd must wear his best royal armor. The shepherd tried on the heavy armor and frowned. "I can't fight with all this, Your Majesty," he said. "I'm not used to it." So he took it off and picked up his shepherd's stick and sling and 5 smooth stones. Not sure what would happen next, the shepherd went out to meet the giant. When he saw the little shepherd near him, the giant raised his head and laughed like a clap of thunder. "What's that stick for?" he roared. "Did you mistake me for a dog?" The giant called down curses from his god. "Come on, little boy, I will give your body to the birds and animals to eat," he shouted. The shepherd answered, "You are coming against me with sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." He reached into his bag and took out a stone. He put it in the sling and threw. The stone hit the giant on the forehead, breaking his skull, and he fell face downward on the ground. The shepherd ran to where the giant has fallen. He took the huge sword out of its sheath and, after looking up to the sky for the briefest of moments, he cut off the giant's head. When the enemy soldiers saw that their hero was dead, the army collapsed into chaos, running away in all directions. The shepherd smiled. He picked up the giant's weapons and returned in triumph to the camp, a hero to his people. So now I'm going to tell you a second version of the story. David was a faithful and diligent shepherd. He believed in God and was very skilled with his sling. David's skills developed as he grew. At exactly the right moment, he volunteered to help the king's army defeat a giant that was threatening them. He hit the giant with a stone and killed him. That day, David proved not only that he was a good shepherd, but also a good soldier for his people. Now, which of these two stories is more inspiring? The second version is more concise, more compact, has the same facts, so arguably it's better. It gives you the same information in a more efficient way. But is it as inspiring? So this is a good example of what makes the difference between a good and a bad story, an inspiring story and one that puts people to sleep. Bad storytelling focuses on the positive only. David is good. He becomes even better. We win. And this is how most corporations and companies like to communicate, because they want to stay positive, so they focus on the positive thing. This is a positive story, but not a good one, not an inspiring one. An inspiring story begins with a challenge, with something unexpected, with something that is risky and troubling. No one answered the challenge of the giant. Then we meet the protagonist. The protagonist, usually someone who's weak, in that case of David, who is unexpected, unlikely, and he makes a choice. His choice here is a double choice. A choice to fight and a choice not to wear the armor of the king, to fight in his own way. And because David is able in the end to throw the stone and kill the giant, that's not the point of the story. The point of the story is how he did it. Right? He did it because he chose to trust in the Lord, that his God would help him. He had courage and he had sincerity. He had the presence of mind and the belief in himself. And those values are transmitted not by saying, and this is why faith is good and courage is good, but because he sets the example in the choices that he makes. So we see this three-part structure: a challenge, something that grabs our attention; a protagonist who is called to make a choice in face of this challenge, in face of this risky or dangerous situation; and how he makes that choice, the values that guide that choice, if they are rewarded in the story, show us what is important to this community. So this is the first part of our study of storytelling. We have to understand that good stories involve risk and uncertainty, not just excellence and success. That details, the moment where David picks up the 5 stones, the moment where David takes off the armor of the king, details are what focus our attention. And details here focus our attention on these 2 moments of choice. And in the choices of the hero, this is how we learn what the community values. In this case, the faith in God, the courage against difficult odds, the sincerity to fight in the way that's true to yourself. And we don't understand that lesson as just a teaching or a set of words. We understand it by feeling them, by sympathizing with the protagonist, who, like us, has to face uncertainty, who, like us, feels weak and vulnerable, but who, like us, can overcome that weakness by making the right choice. This is how stories inspire us.